The roadside diner was peaceful until Arthur Sterling decided it shouldn't be. Route 9 Diner had been sitting at the crossroads of Highway 9, an old mill road for 43 years, and in that time it had seen everything from blizzards to broken hearts. The morning light came in sideways through windows that had been cleaned that same morning by Lily Chun herself, casting long golden rectangles across vinyl booth seats the color of faded red wine. The smell of fresh coffee and bacon grease hung in the air like an old, comfortable sweater. 3 truckers sat at the counter nursing their mugs without speaking, the comfortable silence of men who had nothing to prove. An elderly couple in the far corner shared a plate of pancakes and the newspaper. Outside, the parking lot held a modest collection of pickup trucks, 1 minivan, and 3 heavy, gleaming Harley-Davidson motorcycles parked in a neat row near the entrance. It was, by every measure, a quiet Tuesday morning. Then the black Mercedes pulled into the lot with the kind of aggression that announces itself before the engine even cuts off. Arthur Sterling stepped out before his driver had fully stopped the car, adjusting his cufflinks with the practiced gesture of a man who had spent decades making sure people noticed them. His suit was bespoke, hand-tailored in London at a price that would have covered Lily's rent for an entire year. His shoes were Italian leather, now scuffed with a half-moon of parking lot grit that he hadn't yet noticed and wouldn't have cared about if he had. Behind him, Marcus Thorne unfolded from the back seat. 6 feet 4 inches of broad shoulders and watchful eyes, the kind of bodyguard who moved through spaces like a shadow that had learned to lift weights. 2 more suited men took up positions outside the entrance, arms crossed, scanning the lot with professional disinterest. Arthur Sterling was 48 years old, a Wall Street hedge fund manager and real estate developer who had built his fortune on the simple philosophy that everything had a price and everyone could be bought. He had walked into boardrooms and courtrooms and congressional offices with equal confidence, and he had never once, in 23 years, been wrong about that philosophy. He was about to discover its limits. "I don't know why you brought me to this dump," he announced to no one in particular, pushing through the diner's glass door so hard it swung wide and struck the little bell above it twice instead of once. Several heads turned. Arthur didn't look at any of them. Lily Chun appeared from behind the counter, order pad in hand, her dark ponytail neat beneath a small paper cap. She was 23 years old, with her mother's fine cheekbones and her father's steady eyes. She had been working at Route 9 since she was 19, and she was good at her job in the way that people are good at things they do with genuine care. "Good morning," she said, with a smile that didn't waver. "Booth or counter?" Arthur was already moving toward the largest corner booth, directly in front of one already occupied by a solitary figure reading a newspaper. He slid in without answering and snapped his fingers. "Coffee, now, and make it fast." She wasn't slow. She was, in fact, quite fast. But the diner's coffee maker was brewing a fresh pot, and the 38 seconds it took for the carafe to fill was apparently 38 seconds too many for Arthur Sterling. When Lily finally arrived at his table, gracefully, quickly, carrying not only his coffee, but a small pitcher of cream she'd correctly guessed he'd want, the carafe's edge caught slightly on the rim of his upturned cup. A single brown droplet, no larger than a dime, landed on the white tablecloth 3 inches from his suit sleeve. Not on his sleeve. Near it. Arthur's reaction was so disproportionate that the 3 truckers at the counter all stopped chewing at the same time. "You clumsy little nobody." Arthur's arrogant laugh echoed through the room, sharp and humorless, the laugh of someone who finds power amusing rather than comedy. His expensive custom-tailored suit was a stark contrast to the worn-out diner. He reached out and grabbed Lily by the arm before she could step back. Not a touch, not a restraint, but a grip. His fingers closed around her forearm with the casual certainty of a man who had never once been told to let go of something he was holding. "Please, sir, you're hurting me," Lily whispered, trying to pull away, her voice carefully controlled, trained by years of difficult customers not to give them the reaction they were looking for. Arthur just laughed louder, pulling out a thick stack of $100 bills and slapping them on the table with a crack that made the elderly woman in the corner flinch. "I could buy this pathetic dump and ruin your life before my breakfast gets cold," he announced, his voice filling every corner of the diner. "Who's going to stop me?" He didn't notice the man sitting in the booth directly behind him. The man had been there when Arthur arrived, settled into the booth's corner with the ease of someone thoroughly at home in his own body. He was large, not the cultivated. Jim maintained large of Arthur's bodyguard, but the kind of large that comes from decades of physical living, from hauling engines and riding hard roads and standing in doorways that other men simply didn't approach. He was perhaps 55, with a silver-threaded beard trimmed close to a jaw that looked like it had been cut from granite, and gray eyes that had the quality of deep water, calm on the surface, with unknowable things moving far below. He wore a heavy leather vest over a dark flannel shirt. The vest was old and well-kept, covered in patches the way only an earned vest can be covered, each one placed with the deliberate significance of a medal. On the front left breast, a small rectangular patch identified him simply, President. And on the back of that vest, sprawling across the full width of his broad shoulders in faded but unmistakable glory, was the iconic Death's Head, the grinning skull with wings that generations of men had learned, in the particular way that lessons carved deepest are learned, never to ignore. The patch of the Hells Angels. The biker didn't shout. He didn't stand up immediately. He simply stopped reading his newspaper. His eyes, which had been moving across a column about commodity prices, went still. The newspaper remained raised in his hands, perfectly level, as if he were still reading it. But the eyes were no longer focused on the page. Clink. The sound of the Hells Angels boss setting his heavy ceramic coffee mug down on the table was barely a whisper, a single, deliberate sound, low and measured, the way a judge sets down a gavel not to signal chaos, but to end it. Yet somehow, that single, slow movement made the entire diner freeze in absolute terror. Marcus Thorne heard it. Marcus, who had been scanning the room with professional detachment, turned toward the sound with the instinct of a man whose survival reflexes had been honed through years of genuine danger. His eyes found the mug on the table. Then they traveled upward, over the leather vest, past the president patch, and landed on the Death's Head. His face did not change expression. Trained men don't let their faces change. But he took one very small, very deliberate step backward. Arthur kept laughing. The man in the booth set his newspaper down flat on the table. He did it the way he'd set down the coffee cup, without hurry, without drama, with the absolute certainty of a man who has never needed to rush because things have always, eventually, arranged themselves according to his will. He smoothed the fold of the newspaper with one large hand, a gesture so unhurried it seemed almost domestic. Then he stood up. Jim, Iron, Vance was not tall in the way that Marcus was tall. Marcus had the height of someone engineered for intimidation, built upward to fill space. Jim Vance was tall in a different way, the way old trees are tall, rooted, immovable, with a presence that made the space around him seem smaller without him having moved a single aggressive muscle. He straightened to his full 6 feet 2 inches and simply stood for a moment, as if giving the room time to understand that something had fundamentally changed. The 3 truckers at the counter had all turned on their stools simultaneously, not dramatically, not as if preparing for a fight, but in the slow, synchronized way that animals in a field all lift their heads at the same moment when they sense something on the wind. Jim stepped out of his booth and walked around to Arthur's table. His boots were heavy on the linoleum, each step measured and unhurried, and the sound of them seemed to fill the diner in a way that made Arthur's continued laughter sound thinner and thinner, like a radio being tuned away from its station. He stopped 2 feet from Arthur Sterling. He didn't lean in. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't touch anyone. "Let go of her arm," Jim Vance said. His voice was low and even, with the quality of a sound that doesn't need to be loud to be heard in every corner of a room. It was the voice of a man who had issued instructions in places far louder and far more dangerous than this one, and had never once needed to repeat himself. Arthur turned, still holding Lily's arm, and looked up at Jim with the expression of a man who has just had his entertainment interrupted by the help. What he saw was a large man in a biker vest. Old leather, old patches, silver beard. The kind of man he would have crossed the street to avoid on a dark night, but felt entirely comfortable dismissing in a Tuesday morning diner, with his bodyguard standing 6 feet away. What he did not see, what he was constitutionally incapable of seeing, was what Marcus had seen. The precise significance of the patches. The particular history encoded in a death's head worn by a man with a president patch. "Who?" Arthur said, letting the word hang in the air with magnificent contempt. Are you? Someone asking you wants to let go of her arm, Jim said. Arthur looked at Jim the way he looked at everything that displeased him, with the serene confidence of a man who had never once encountered a problem that money couldn't reclassify as someone else's problem. You're a leather-wearing drifter in a roadside diner, Arthur said, his voice carrying that particular sing-song quality of cruelty that has been practiced so long it becomes fluent. I have more money in my watch than you'll earn in 5 years. He finally released Lily's arm, not because Jim had asked him to, but to gesture expansively at Marcus. Get this man out of my sight. Marcus Thorne did not move. Arthur turned to look at his bodyguard. Marcus was standing very still, his eyes fixed on Jim Vance's vest with an expression Arthur had never seen on his face in 3 years of employment. It was not quite fear. Marcus was too professional for fear to show clearly. But it was the precise expression of a man who has just completed a rapid calculation and arrived at a number he does not like. Marcus, Arthur said. Marcus took one step forward. His eyes traveled from the president patch to the death's head and back again. The step brought him close enough to read every patch with complete clarity, and whatever he read there finished the calculation. He stopped. And then, to Arthur Sterling's absolute bewilderment, Marcus Thorne took one deliberate step backward. Mr. Sterling, Marcus said, his voice quiet and very careful, like a man speaking near something fragile. I think we should pay our bill and go. Arthur stared at his bodyguard as if Marcus had just suggested they swim to Europe. You're fired, he said, almost reflexively, the way he fired people when they ceased to be useful, which was the primary context in which he'd ever understood other human beings. He turned back to Jim, something ugly moving through his expression now, not just contempt but the hot, dangerous embarrassment of a man who has been defied in front of an audience. You think you can walk up to me? Arthur jabbed one manicured finger toward Jim's chest. I will find out where you live, who you know, and I will burn everything you care about to the ground. That is not a threat. That is a promise. Jim Vance looked at the finger 2 inches from his chest. He did not look angry. He did not look threatened. He looked, if anything, profoundly patient. The way a mountain looks patient when a very small and very agitated thing throws itself against it. I've asked you twice, Jim said quietly. I won't ask 3 times. And somewhere in the very back of Arthur Sterling's mind, in the part that had kept him alive through all the wars of finance and leverage and naked aggression that had built his fortune, a small and ancient alarm began, very faintly, to sound. He ignored it. Arthur Sterling had made the decision to shove Jim Vance, had actually raised his hands, spread his fingers, committed his weight forward, when the sound reached him. It started as a vibration, a tremor in the air that arrived before any identifiable noise, the way thunder sometimes precedes itself in the body before it arrives in the ears. Then it resolved into sound, a deep, sustained, mechanical roar that built and built and built from somewhere in the parking lot outside until the windows of Route 9 Diner were humming in their frames and the cutlery on the tables was whispering against the porcelain. The sound of Harley-Davidson engines. Dozens of them. Arthur froze with his hands still raised, his brain stumbling over the new information with the confused alarm of a man who has stepped off a curb and found no street beneath him. Through the diner's front windows, the parking lot was transforming. Heavy motorcycles were rolling in from 3 directions simultaneously, filling the lot in a pattern that managed to look both organic and deliberate, the kind of choreography that only works when everyone involved has practiced it so many times it has become pure instinct. They parked in rows around the building, along the front, along both sides, effectively encircling Route 9 Diner with a perimeter of chrome and leather and rumbling displacement. The 2 suited men Arthur had stationed at the entrance were visible through the glass, standing exactly where he'd left them, except that they were no longer looking outward. They were standing back to back, slowly turning, watching the motorcycles fill the lot with the particular stillness of men who have just understood that their current position offers them absolutely nothing. Then the sound cut off. All of it. All at once, as if someone had thrown a single switch. The sudden silence was somehow louder than the roar had been. Inside the diner, 3 things happened simultaneously. The elderly couple in the corner, with the calm practicality of people who have lived long enough to recognize the precise moment to become invisible, slid quietly out of their booth and walked with unhurried dignity into the kitchen through the swinging door. The three truckers at the counter stood up from their stools. They did it without looking at each other, with the synchronized ease of men responding to a signal they'd been waiting for, and as they stood, they reached back and pulled off the flannel overshirts and canvas work jackets they'd been wearing all morning. Beneath those unremarkable outer layers, each of them was wearing a leather vest. Each vest carried the same patches, the same death's head. The man who had been eating a Western omelet 2 stools from Arthur's bodyguard was also the road captain of the local Hells Angels chapter. The trucker nearest the door who'd been reading a paperback was the sergeant-at-arms. The third man, who had not spoken a single word since Arthur walked in, was the vice president. The kitchen door swung open again, and the cook and the dishwasher came out, not in kitchen whites, but in leather. Even old Dale, who managed Route 9, removed his apron to reveal the vest beneath it. The diner, Arthur was beginning to understand, had never been empty. Arthur Sterling stood in the center of Route 9 diner and discovered, for the first time in his adult life, the particular variety of fear that comes not from a single threat, but from the simultaneous recognition that every exit has already been considered by people far more experienced at this than you are. Jim Vance had not moved. He stood exactly where he'd been standing, his gray eyes on Arthur, his expression unchanged. "Who are you people?" Arthur said, and to his own humiliation, the words came out at approximately half their intended volume. Jim reached into the front pocket of his vest and removed something small, a photograph, worn at the corners, the kind of photograph that has been carried for a long time. He held it out toward Arthur, who took it with hands that weren't quite steady. The photograph showed 2 younger men, perhaps 30 years old, standing in front of a row of motorcycles. Both were wearing Hells Angels vests. Both were grinning at the camera with the uncomplicated happiness of men who are exactly where they belong. One was recognizable, a younger Jim Vance, his beard still dark, the lines of his face smoother, but his posture already carrying that unmistakable quality of settled certainty. The other man, Arthur didn't recognize. But Lily, standing at the edge of the room where she'd retreated after Jim intervened, made a very small, very soft sound when she saw it. "I took that picture 22 years ago," Jim said. "That man next to me, his name was David Chun. He was my brother. Not the blood kind. The kind that's made from years and miles, and watching each other's backs through things I won't bother explaining to you." He paused. "He was the best man I have ever known. He died 3 years ago. Cancer." Another pause. "He made me promise to look after his daughter." The silence in the diner had the weight of something structural. "The girl whose arm you just had your hand around," Jim said, "is my brother's daughter." Arthur looked at Lily. Lily met his eyes steadily, her arms wrapped around herself, not in distress, he realized, but in the particular self-containment of someone who has been watched over in a way she couldn't always see, and who carries that security in her bones without always knowing its source. "In the Hells Angels," Jim said, his voice still carrying that terrible, quiet evenness, "we look after our family." Marcus Thorne, standing against the wall where he'd retreated with the quiet efficiency of a man trying to reduce his profile, closed his eyes briefly. He had been in dangerous situations. He had worked for difficult men. He had stood in rooms where things were about to go very wrong and had navigated them with professionalism and nerve. He had never stood in a room where he was this thoroughly outmaneuvered before he had even understood the game. "Mr. Sterling," Marcus said, for the second time, with even greater quiet than the first. "Sir, please listen to this man." Arthur Sterling had not become worth $400 million by knowing when to surrender. This was, historically, among his greatest professional strengths. The refusal to acknowledge defeat had kept him in negotiations past the point where other men walked away, had kept him holding positions through downturns that washed other investors out. The stubbornness that had made him rich was not a quality he could simply switch off because the context had changed. It was also, at this particular moment, placing him in extraordinary danger. He straightened his jacket. He cleared his throat. He arranged his face into something attempting to pass for composure. "All right," he said. "I'm a reasonable man. There's been a misunderstanding." He reached into his inside jacket pocket and withdrew the thing that had never, in 23 years, failed to solve a problem: his checkbook. It was slim and black, the kind issued to accounts with seven-figure balances. He set it on the table with the reverence of a man placing a sacred object on an altar. "Name your number." Jim looked at the checkbook. He looked at it the way you look at something that is not relevant to the current conversation. He said nothing. $100,000, Arthur said, his tone taking on the brisk efficiency of a man used to this part going faster. "To the girl, to you, to whatever organization you want to name. Charitable donation. We all go our separate ways." Jim's expression didn't shift by a degree. 200,000. Arthur picked up the checkbook and held it out directly. "Final offer." "Put that away," Jim said. 300,000. Arthur's voice had taken on a thin, high quality it didn't usually carry, like a wire being stretched past its rated capacity. "That is a very generous." "Arthur." Jim's use of his first name was not friendly. It was the use of a name to command someone's full attention. "I'm not interested in your money. There is no number in that checkbook that changes what happens next." Arthur stared at him. The concept was so foreign that for a moment his face simply didn't know what to do with it. He snapped the checkbook shut. If money wasn't the language, then power was. He had power too, a different kind, but power nonetheless, the kind that wore suits and made phone calls and arrived with flashing lights. He took out his phone. "I'm calling the chief of police," he announced, looking around the room as if addressing an audience that needed to understand the significance of what he was about to say. "Personal friend. I'll have every unit in the county here inside 20 minutes. "Make your call," Jim said. Arthur hesitated. Then, because he had no remaining moves that didn't involve complete capitulation, which his entire psychological architecture was built to prevent, he scrolled to Chief Raymond Holloway's contact and pressed dial. It rang twice. "Arthur." Raymond Holloway's voice carried the weight of a man who took calls from Arthur Sterling because Arthur Sterling had been generous to his fundraisers, and who had always regarded this as a somewhat one-sided transaction he was never entirely comfortable with. "Ray." Arthur's voice was back to its usual register, commanding, curt. "I need you to send units to Route 9, Diner on Highway 9. I'm being held against my will by a criminal organization, and I need—" "Wait," Holloway said. "Route 9 Diner." A pause. "Arthur, who exactly are you dealing with?" "A biker gang. Hell's Angels. Their president, some man named Vance. Jim Vance." The pause on the other end of the line was 2 full seconds long. Arthur had experienced many pauses in his professional life. He had a sophisticated taxonomy of them. The pause of calculation, the pause of uncertainty, the pause of a man about to yield. He knew all of these well. He did not immediately recognize the pause of a man deciding how honest to be. "Arthur," Raymond Holloway said, his voice shifting into a register Arthur had never heard from him before. Careful, measured, carrying the weight of a man choosing his words as if they were load-bearing. "I'm going to tell you something as a friend. Ray, I need units at—" "Arthur." The word was quiet and firm. "Listen to me. If you are standing in a room with Jim Vance and the people he's with, I cannot help you. I'm not saying I won't. I'm saying I cannot." Another pause. "What I can tell you is that you should do exactly what that man asks you to do. Whatever he's asking, whatever it is, you do it. Ray, you are the chief of police. And I'm telling you, as clearly as I know how, you are on your own in that room. I'm sorry, Arthur. Good luck." The line went dead. Arthur held the phone and stared at it. He tried his attorney next, then a state senator whose campaigns he had funded heavily, then a man in the governor's office. 2 didn't answer. 1 listened, heard the name Jim Vance, offered brief condolences, and ended the call. The senator stayed on the line for 30 seconds before arriving at essentially the same conclusion as the chief of police. The diner was absolutely silent as Arthur made his calls. No one commented. No one hurried him. Jim Vance leaned against the counter with his arms crossed, entirely unbothered, and waited with the patience of a man who already knows how the calls are going to end. When Arthur finally lowered his phone for the last time, the room around him had the quality of something that had already been decided and was simply waiting for him to catch up. The psychological architecture collapsed gradually and then all at once, the way ice on a roof holds through weeks of cold and then, suddenly, doesn't. Arthur Sterling had been built on the certainty that money was the universal language, That power was a currency you could always exchange for outcomes, that the world was ultimately and fundamentally for sale. He had just encountered something that wasn't. Jim pushed off from the counter and walked to the center of the diner. He didn't speak immediately. He looked at Arthur Sterling for a long moment with those deep-water gray eyes, and the look contained something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite contempt, something older and more considered than either, the look of a man who has seen this particular species of ruin before and feels, for it, only a very tired kind of clarity. "Lily," he said, without looking away from Arthur. Lily stepped forward from where she had been standing near the kitchen door. She had not cried. She had not trembled. She stood now with her chin level and her eyes clear, in the way of someone who has been protected from birth by people she didn't always know were there, and who carries that security in her bones without always being able to name its source. "Do you want to tell him what you want?" Jim asked her. "Or do you want me to handle it?" Lily looked at Arthur for a moment. Then she said, very quietly, "I want him to understand that I am a person." Jim nodded. He turned back to Arthur. "You know what I've noticed about men like you," Jim said, his voice still carrying that same level quality. No heat in it, no performance of anger, just the straight delivery of an observation earned over a long life. "You've had so much money for so long that you've forgotten people exist. You walk through the world and you see obstacles and conveniences and liabilities. You see things you can use and things you have to step around. But you stopped seeing people a long time ago." He paused. "That's the thing about the kind of life I've lived. You can't afford to forget that every person in every room is fully real. The cost of that mistake is too high." Arthur said nothing. The phone hung loosely at his side, forgotten. "Get on your knees," Jim said. The words were quiet. They were not accompanied by any threatening gesture or raised fist or any of the theatrical apparatus of intimidation that Arthur had always assumed was what force looked like. They were simply a sentence, plainly delivered. Arthur Sterling's knees bent. He didn't make a conscious decision to kneel. It was as though something fundamental in the physics of the room had changed, and standing upright had become, without any visible transition, no longer available to him. The Italian leather shoes, the bespoke trousers, the suit that had been pressed that morning by a man whose sole professional function was the pressing of Arthur Sterling's suits. All of it came to rest on the linoleum floor of Route 9 diner, on the surface that Lily Chun had mopped at 5:30 that morning, and which retained, despite her best efforts, the faint residue of 43 years of oil and coffee and the ordinary lives of ordinary people. "Tell her what you did," Jim said, "and mean it." Arthur looked up at Lily Chun from the floor. What he saw was not what he'd seen an hour ago, when he had looked at her and perceived an obstacle, a convenience with a name tag, an opportunity for the particular small cruelty that powerful men allow themselves as a kind of recreation. What he saw now, for the first time, with the forced clarity of the completely and utterly defeated, was a young woman, the daughter of a man who had been loved, the center of a protection so extensive and so quiet that she had walked through the world not knowing its full shape, but carrying its warmth in her regardless. "I'm sorry," Arthur said. His voice didn't sound like his voice. It had lost all the architecture of command that had been built into it over decades, the resonance, the certainty, the practiced authority. What remained was something much smaller and much more genuine. "I grabbed your arm." The words came out slowly, as if he were reading from a document in a language he was only beginning to learn. "I humiliated you in front of everyone. I treated you like you weren't a person." He stopped. He swallowed. "I'm sorry. I don't." He stopped again. "I'm sorry." Lily Chun looked at Arthur Sterling for a long moment. "Thank you," she said simply. She didn't say it was all right. She didn't say she forgave him. She received the apology as exactly what it was, a belated, inadequate, but real acknowledgement, and she offered back something honest in return. Jim reached down and picked up the thick stack of $100 bills that Arthur had slapped onto the table earlier, and placed the entire stack in Lily's hand. "For the trouble," he said. Then he looked back at Arthur, still on the floor. "The cash in your wallet as well," Jim said. "All of it." Marcus Thorne, with the resignation of a man who has fully made his peace with the situation, reached into his own jacket, removed his wallet, and placed the entire contents on the nearest table without being asked. He looked at Arthur with an expression that communicated, clearly and without ambiguity, Please, just do what the man says. Arthur removed his wallet. He placed everything on the table. He did not count it. He did not look at it as it left his hands. You're going to get up, Jim said. Walk out of this diner, get in your car, and leave this county. You're not going to come back. You're not going to send anyone back on your behalf. You're not going to purchase the building, contact real estate developers, or reach out to anyone associated with Route 9 in any capacity. Are we clear? Yes, Arthur said. And Arthur? Jim waited until the man on the floor met his eyes. If you ever, in any diner, on any morning, in any state of this country, put your hand on a woman who doesn't want you touching her, remember this morning. Remember exactly what you're doing right now. Arthur Sterling got to his feet. He did not dust off his trousers. He did not adjust his cufflinks or check his reflection in the window or perform any of the small rituals of self-presentation that had bookended every public moment of his adult life. He simply walked toward the door in a straight line, eyes fixed on the middle distance, and pushed through the glass and into the parking lot without looking back. Marcus followed. At the door, he paused, turned back, and looked at Jim Vance. He gave a single, small nod, the nod of one professional to another, across a very wide gulf of context and circumstance, but genuine. Jim returned it. The sound of the Mercedes starting was brief and quickly fading, swallowed almost immediately by the open distance of Highway 9, and then the parking lot held only the Harleys and the morning light, and Route 9 diner went back to being very quiet in the particular way that places go quiet after something large and necessary has finally been completed. Jim Vance walked back to his booth. He sat down the same way he'd sat down 2 hours earlier, settling into the corner with the ease of a man entirely comfortable in his own body and his own life. He smoothed the newspaper flat with one hand and reached for his coffee mug. It had gone cold while the morning's business was being concluded. Dale appeared from behind the counter, already holding a fresh pot. He poured without a word, the way you pour for a man you've known a long time, and there was a kind of ceremony in the simplicity of it. Thanks, Jim said. Lily Chin walked over and stood beside the booth for a moment, the stack of bills in her hands, her expression carrying something complex and quiet that hadn't been there before, something that looked, if you knew what you were looking for, very much like the particular peace that comes from discovering the full shape of a protection you'd always felt but never quite understood. Jim looked up at her. Your father, he said, would have been proud of you. Today, and every day, the way you held yourself in there. He shook his head slightly. That was his daughter. Through and through. Lily was quiet for a moment. Then, for the first time in all the years she had known him, she sat down across from Jim in the booth. He didn't move to discourage it. Tell me something about him, she said. Something I don't know. Jim picked up his coffee cup and wrapped both hands around its familiar warmth, and he looked out the window at the long row of motorcycles glinting in the morning sun. The same sun that was climbing above the tree line now. The same highway stretching out in both directions. The same peaceful Tuesday that had briefly been disturbed and was now, with the particular resilience of ordinary things, quietly resuming itself. Outside, the Harleys started up one by one, not in a single wave, but in a rolling sequence, a measured chorus of mechanical voices pulling out of the lot in unhurried procession, heading back to whatever roads had brought them here. Jim took a slow sip of his coffee. Well, he said, there was this one time, in New Mexico. And through the freshly washed windows of Route 9 diner, the last of the motorcycles rolled out onto Highway 9, the sound of the engines rising and then, gradually, gently, fading into the open morning, like something that had always been there, watching over this stretch of road and the people on it, and always would be.